Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Indiana's state capitol. Today, we are honored to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the day that Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, lay at the state capitol on his way to Springfield, Illinois, after he had been assassinated in Washington. At this point, I would ask that all of you please stand as we have the color guard present the colors. You may be seated. I want to thank some of our special guests that are here, the children that are in the room. Today we have representatives from the Andrew J. Brown Academy here in Indianapolis, the Immaculate Heart of Mary School, St. Lawrence, St. Christopher, Greensburg High School. So welcome school groups. Thank you very much. Our Civil War reenactors are from the Indiana 49th Company F, and we appreciate them being here today. In a moment, you'll be hearing, up above us, is a choir called the Manticore Choir. 150 years ago, that same choir was here singing when Abraham Lincoln was brought into the rotunda. So this is the second Statehouse that stood on these grounds. And as I mentioned 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln lay in the Statehouse in the rotunda. It wasn't this one, but it was on the same space. And it is there that 100,000 people came through and visited him in that single day. 100,000 people came through to see the president. So we're fortunate also today, you'll see in this reenactment that there's a coffin that will be coming in, and that coffin was provided to us by the Davies County Historical Society in southern Indiana, and it's a historic coffin. So as we begin, if you'll all roll back time, today is April 30th, 1865. 16 days ago, the President of the United States was at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., watching a play, and was shot. The following day, he passes away. 15 days later, he's arriving in Indianapolis. And with that, I'd like to ask the choir to begin. Come ye disconsolate, as the honor guard brings forth the casket with Abraham Lincoln. Would you please rise? Please remain standing. Presenting memorials on behalf of the three branches of government. Governor Michael R. Pence, Governor of Indiana. Chief Justice Loretta Rush from the Indiana Supreme Court. Deputy Speaker of the Indiana House of Representatives, Matt Lehman. Please be seated. One of Abraham Lincoln's most famous speeches was the one he gave at Gettysburg. As many of you know, the speech at Gettysburg was to commemorate the loss of soldiers on both sides, the South and the North. The president was not the featured speaker, but was actually there only to dedicate the grounds. There was a gentleman who spoke, Edward Everett, for 2 hours, and he was the keynote speaker. The President of the United States gave a short 2-minute presentation, the Gettysburg Address. Today, I would like to ask Jordan Sumlin from the Andrew J. Brown Academy to come forward. And the Manticore Choir is going to be singing part of the Gettysburg Address, and Jordan is going to be reciting part of it as well. So with that, I would ask the Manticore Choir to begin.
brave men, living or dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world was little, nor long, remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fall here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated here to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that which called, for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain.
It is my pleasure now to introduce the governor of the great state of Indiana, Michael R. Pence. Governor Pence.
Thank you, Jim Corridon, and our state archivist and the Director of Public Records for this labor of love in commemorating this moment a century and a half ago when the Lincoln funeral train came and the funeral took place on these grounds for one of the greatest men in the history of the world. Jim, we thank you for bringing together what has already been described as the best commemoration in America to date on this long train ride. Would you join me in thanking our state archivist? I also want to thank the Chief Justice, Loretta Rush, for being here and honoring us with her presence, Representative Matt Lehman, to the honor guard, to our honored guests, to all of these wonderful kids who I hope will remember this day and be able to say that you were here on that day when Indiana remembered one of our greatest native sons. I also would invite another round of applause for the choir that actually makes a return performance. Manticore actually performed at Lincoln's funeral at our Statehouse 150 years ago. They returned today more beautiful than ever. We thank you for your glorious presentation. Good book tells us if you owe debts, pay debts. If honor, then honor. If respect, then respect. We gather here today in our State House to honor President Abraham Lincoln, just as tens of thousands of Hoosiers did here on this very spot 150 years ago today. He had arrived on his funeral train, traveling from Washington, D.C. to what would become the burial site, as it is to this day in Springfield, Illinois. Much earlier that day, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the train had arrived in Richmond, Indiana, where 10,000 Hoosiers were assembled in the early morning hours to pay tribute to one of our own. At Centerville, Germantown, Cambridge City, Dublin, and Louisville, thousands of people were gathered. In Knightstown, a choir chanted a solemn and beautiful hymn as the train moved among our mourning citizens. And so it was 7 o'clock in the morning on that cold and rainy April 30th, 1865, that amid the ringing bells and the firing of cannons, soldiers carried Lincoln's casket into our Statehouse. The President's body lay in state in an earlier version of the Statehouse that we see around us today. But it was here, and it was on a place just a few short steps from where this casket rests today. The ceremonies closed at 10 o'clock with a procession of the marshals around the coffin, after which the guard took charge of the remains and the last glance of Abraham Lincoln had been taken by Hoosiers forever. Indianapolis was one of the many stops along the funeral train's route, but the crowd that gathered here was among the largest that would gather anywhere in America. There's a good reason for that. Lincoln was a Hoosier. And we remember that today as surely as Hoosiers remembered that so many years ago. We take great pride in the fact that Lincoln's formative years were spent right here in Indiana. As you've learned in your classrooms, President Lincoln was born in Kentucky. He was 7 years old when his parents climbed aboard that barge and came right across the Ohio River to their little farm in Spencer County, Indiana. That was 1816, which was the very same year that we became a state. And sometimes I think that Providence had a hand in the fact that the very year we were minted as a state, our greatest native son, then a boy, would come to be one of us. Young Lincoln spent his youth here in Indiana. He learned to make a living working as a farmer, as a carpenter, as a ferry boat operator. He knew what hard work was all about. And all you need to do is go down to Spencer County and walk through those woods. Think about how hard it was to clear those trees, how hard it was to till that soil, to understand why Abraham Lincoln was a man who knew how to swing an axe, and he knew to work by the sweat of his brow. But it wasn't all hard work. His relatives would recall that he most enjoyed reading and learning. And in the Lincoln cabin that is remembered in southern Indiana, we hear stories of him sitting and reading by candlelight night after night after night. Abraham Lincoln became a great leader because Abraham Lincoln was a great reader. Remember that. By the time he left Indiana in 1830, he was a grown man of 21, standing 6 foot 4 inches tall, strong and wiry. One of my predecessors, Otis Bowen, who we laid to rest in this very place not too long ago, said it probably best when he thought of Lincoln's upbringing here in Indiana. He said, Lincoln made Illinois, but Indiana made Lincoln. No truer words. He resettled in Illinois, learned to practice law, and gained a reputation for honesty, intellect, and good humor. He served in the Illinois state legislature and later in the U.S. Congress for a term. And in 1860, we all know he was elected President of the United States of America. Now, we all know it's easy 150 years after his passing for modern Americans to see Lincoln as some mythical figure from a long ago past. But I hope that moments like today, which were really no different than this day 150 years ago, teach us otherwise. It's important to understand, we all need to understand just how relevant Abraham Lincoln remains to this day. One biographer wrote this: "He is one of the few Americans whose life and words bridge time. At critical moments in our nation's history, his eloquent words have become contemporary again and again." Now, he wasn't a perfect man, and he probably would have been the first to say it. But he was a great man. He was an honest man. And he was wise. His influence still touches our lives even now today, principally in the fact that our Union survived a time of great division and war. Soon after he was elected president, 11 states proclaimed that they were leaving the Union of our still young nation, creating a nation of their own, dissolving their ties to the United States. And so began what would come to be known as the American Civil War. And Lincoln's great purpose was to save the Union, to ensure that, in his words, government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. And he achieved that. And he saved the Union. But he achieved one more cause, deeper and more meaningful in the life of our nation. Abraham Lincoln envisioned a nation that lived up to the words of our founders, who wrote that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. He envisioned a country where all men and women lived as free people. He wanted to break the shackles of slavery from America forever. And so he did. History bears witness that Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union, and Abraham Lincoln ended slavery in America forever. The cost was great, but he never relented. He persevered. Receiving daily reports from the field, President Lincoln mourned along with hundreds of thousands of devastated families. 600,000 Americans would fall in the course of the Civil War, countless more injured and infirm for the rest of their lives. In April of 1865, the war was finally ending, and it was a time for peace and for healing. But then, just 4 days after Robert E. Lee's surrender, on April 14th, President Lincoln himself would fall at the hands of an assassin. The nation was heartbroken and grieved. And today we gather to mark his passing with a sense of the disconsolate who gathered in this place 150 years ago. We can't fully appreciate the pain and heartache that was felt here on that day in 1865 by war-weary Hoosiers. Just imagine, if you will, a time of war and heartbreak and heartache coming to an end, to be punctuated by the loss of your champion. It's almost too much to bear. But Hoosiers bore it, and America bore it. But it's important that we remember what that cost was today. Although we can't comprehend what they were feeling, we can pause, we can think about a great president, one of Indiana's own. And we can remember the spirit of that man, who said in his second inaugural address words that echo well past this day 150 years ago. And even though he would pass into history, his words would be a balm and a healing to the nation. For he had said, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive to finish the work we are in. As the choir said today, we bring wounded hearts and anguish to this moment, as Hoosiers did 150 years ago. And we grieve one more time in tribute for a great son of Indiana. But we do not grieve like the rest who have no hope. Because when we see lives like Abraham Lincoln's, when we see integrity and honesty and courage and leadership, we understand why the Union stood. We understand why we became a more perfect Union. And we have confidence that just as they face their future with success and compassion and principle, so shall we face ours. So I rise today with all of you to remember President Abraham Lincoln. May God rest his soul, and may his example and his courage ever inspire the people of our state, our nation, and this world. So help us God. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Governor Pence, for those inspirational words and the reflections on a great man. I'd now like to ask Bailey Schroeder from the Greensburg High School to come forward. In 1865, Walt Whitman, perhaps one of America's most famous poets, was moved by the death of Lincoln, and he wrote perhaps one of his most famous poems, "O Captain, My Captain." And we're pleased to have today Bailey Schroeder from the Greensburg High School reciting the poem for us. Bailey?
O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel, the vessel grim and daring. But O heart, 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 O the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills. For you bouquets and ribbon wreaths, for you the shores a crowding, for you they call the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. Here, Captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head. It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm, he has no pulse nor will. His ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip, the victor ship comes in with object won. Exalt, O shores, and ring, O bells, but I with mournful tread will walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Thank you, Bailey. The first half of our presentations and programs today are coming to a conclusion, and I would like to take this time to thank our special guests representing all three branches of the legislature, the two students who spoke for us today, the 49th Indiana Company F for joining us, the Capitol Tourism Office for helping us with the decor and the interpretation today, the the Davies County Historical Society for providing the replica coffin, and the choir, the Manticore Choir, who's done such a wonderful job singing. At this time, I call on the Manticore Choir to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic as the leadership of the state of Indiana recesses out of the room. Manticore? As the governor and the speaker, deputy speaker, and the chief justice exit the room, we are going to transition over the next couple of minutes. Indiana is an amazing place. It's an imaginary place. And so we're fortunate to be able to let you know that although we just buried Abraham Lincoln, he is about to rise, and he will be here in about 5 minutes. So once the governor and the crew exit, if you'll all just take seats again, and we'll start up in about 2 to 3 minutes, okay?